Workloads protected by VMware are the safest workloads in the multi-cloud. Private cloud, public cloud, any cloud. Stronger, with distributed protection to the API and everything east-west, inside, and cross-cloud. Stronger, with 3 layers of detection, trusting nothing and seeing everything, even the best hidden bad actors. Stronger, with an SE Labs AAA certified advanced NDR that brings the multi-cloud together for the win. You've got workloads, we've got security. VMware Security. Simply stronger. Visit securityweekly.com/VMware to learn more. Picture your team being able to map out the external attack surface as it grows and see the same attack vectors as a hacker does. Most tools out there do asset discovery, but stop there. Enter Detectify. It takes an inventory of exposed web assets and automates vulnerability testing for security misconfigurations, expiring subdomains, and risks in third-party software. Here's the cool part. They crowdsource payloads from leading ethical hackers. It finds bugs you actually want to fix and finds them in time. Start a free 2-week trial by visiting securityweekly.com/Detectify. Go hack yourself.
Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. We've got we've added some good ones to that library this year. Our second interview is with Mr. Scott Crawford, who joins us today to talk about the evolution and future of XDR and the SOC. Scott is closing in on 20 years as an industry analyst and has spent some considerable time before that and has seen some stuff. He got his start as a Unix sysadmin. At one point found himself the CISO of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna. So world traveler. On top of that, he plays piano and used to race jets before. Is it fair to say you had a change of heart that stopped you from racing jets? Or is that too bad?
No, it wasn't actually jets, but aerobatic airplanes. And it wasn't so much a change of heart. It's just that's a great way of life, but it's not the most reliable when you have a young family starting up. So yeah, and I was always attracted to technology anyway, so I went back to grad school at that point. But I maintained my license and maintained my flight instructor certificate as well, too.
Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thank you, Adrian. Pleasure.
So give us some background here. What are the security needs and market forces that gave birth to XDR in the first place? Why is it even a thing right now?
Boy, it's a really good question. When I answer that, I kind of trace the answer back from one of the questions that I get, and I'm sure you do too with your coverage of the space, hear a lot, which is, there's like five or so questions that people consistently ask about this. Isn't XDR just what security operations was always intended to be or always should have been? And the short answer to that is, yeah, up to a certain point it is. The market forces that have kind of gotten us to this point have to do with the way that security operations itself, I see anyway, have evolved over the last several years. We started back in, you alluded to my past having been a CISO before, and that was the time when we were just pulling in a lot of point products for security that were doing a lot of monitoring and therefore generating a ton of data across these point products. And each individual one, like intrusion detection and prevention systems, at the time would generate huge volumes of data. And knowing what to do with it was just, a big challenge. So that was part of the genesis of like security information and event management systems. You wanted to have something that would pull that log data together, correlate, identify largely through a rules basis issues that need to be prioritized and investigated. And that helped cut through some of the noise there. But the complexity of the environment continued to grow. The number of sources continued to grow. However, security teams were hamstrung the technology itself was hamstrung a bit by limitations such as if you're only going to depend on log data as your primary tool for visibility, not everything gets logged. And in fact, developers writing an application, if you're working feverishly to get an MVP out, how often is logging, not aside from this past week, but how often is logging on the top of your priority list for getting a...
This has not been a normal week.
No,
for anybody.
Has not in any sense of the word. But in ordinary days, ordinary time, dog years, if you will, there's, how often is that a requirement for getting an MVP out if you're rushing a product to market? It's not always real high, and it often comes in later when you're trying to troubleshoot and triage issues. So if you're dependent on logging in the first place, you may not have the visibility you want or need. Secondarily, not everything is available via logs. If you need to investigate the context of what's happened to you and you're looking at, say, changes on an individual endpoint, what are you going to do when you need to, you've got a suspicion that there might have been changes to the software complement, that software components may wind up in very odd places, not typical to store DLLs on the desktop, for example. Changes to configuration. Some of those things just simply aren't available as log data. I mean, some of the changes might be recorded if the system records it, but if you're going to develop that context yourself, you're going to need to go to the source. So the need for telemetry from sources that you could pull together to enrich that context was part of the driver for initially technologies like endpoint threat detection and response, where before you were limited to things like, definitely before 2014 and the rise of like OS Query, for example, you were limited to, Windows sysinternals. So, thank you, Mark Rusinovich, for that. But that's not exactly an enterprise architecture. So you had to build something in the direction of being able to gather the telemetry that you need. Where the X started coming in was the variety of sources that we saw SecOps teams beginning to pull together, not only to enrich that context, but to deliver wider telemetry, more comprehensive correlation, prioritization, and learning across a number of fronts. So it's not just the telemetry. People think of network threat detection. To some extent, they even think of things like email threat detection as well, too. What's the kind of insight you can get from the kind of content that's been targeted at your individual users and endpoints? So the X implies something potentially broader, potentially open-ended. There are some segments where we see playing commonly in the field right now, but the idea is to be more comprehensive about what you're taking in to better enrich that context to the extent that you can actually make use of that data in operational investigation, triage, and remediation and response. So that's a very long way to say the short answer to is an XDR what security operations always should have been? Yes, it is, to a very large degree.
So what I'm hearing is that the phrase next generation has been rebranded as X, as just a letter X. Is that what that is?
Well, this is kind of the subset of questions, and I'm sure you get them too, about the buzzy aspects of the topic. Is this just SecOps NG? You know from past experience that I'm not a great fan of the term next generation, just to take that case in point, because it's a bit of an oxymoron. If you're talking about what's going on right now, isn't that right? This generation?
It's a generational term. Yeah.
Exactly. How much farther into the future can we not go and still be in the present without getting into quantum space or something like that? But
yeah. It's you remember ASAP?
Yeah. Yes, I do, as a matter of fact, and really liked that concept. In fact, we were able to make a great deal of use out of that concept. And since it's really yours, I invite you to go ahead and explain what we mean by that, or what you mean by that, to our audience.
Yeah, so there weren't many acronyms or terms I came up with at 451 Research, because Gartner has the license for that, apparently, or the audience. It's really hard to get something to stick, but I came up with the term actionable situational awareness platform, and had kind of like a map of what it would be. And XDR actually looks, fits pretty well onto that that framework that I put together. And because a lot of it is situational awareness, and talking about you being a pilot, like there's all kinds of metaphors and places that we can draw from, for the kind of telemetry that the SOC needs to see what's going on here. But I think one of the things that took me the most about, actionable was kind of the key piece of that I felt didn't exist back then with security analytics platforms and with SIMs and things like that. Like, the data was there, but nobody knew what to do with it unless they had a whole development team just focused on detection engineering and like figuring out what to do with all that data they had collected. You might call them SIM engineers, SIM developers, detection engineers, but a lot of organizations had enough money to buy the product, but not for the people to do something useful with the data. And that's what I'm starting to see with XDR that's different from existing products, is that there are teams behind a lot of these XDR products that are actively, like, in some of my testing, I get notifications every time there's an update. And these teams are constantly updating these rules, that detect different kinds of events.
The one distinction I think I would make that I actually prefer your term for over XDR is that the implication of XDR is so focused on threat detection. That's a very hot area of concern right now. In fact, I think it has most recent. Go ahead.
I think that's the only way it can be successful, honestly, is you have to narrow the use cases. That's one of SIEM's big downfalls, is you buy it for compliance, and it could do a whole bunch of other things, or maybe you bought it for something other than compliance. But I remember when we first got our SIEM, and I shoved 1,700 devices logs into it. One of the first things that the IT folks realized is, hey, every time we have any kind of outage or downtime, these guys, the security folks, have this system of record with everything on it, with all the logs on it. So we're just going to, and the security team rolled up under IT. So the VP of IT over all IT would basically take us off whatever we were doing to do root cause analysis every time there was any kind of downtime or big outage on the IT side of things. So I think for XDR to be successful, you have to narrow the use cases down to something very narrow, just threat hunting and threat detection.
That's a really valid point, just to make it usable and actionable. But that pattern we've certainly seen before. I mean, going back a ways, we were talking about, when I first started as an analyst, one of my pet topics was the synergy between what we would consider IT service management at the time, which was really predicated on things like, the service catalog, things like runbook automation, which has its echo in SOAR in terms of security ops today. But most significantly to me was the idea that whole concept around IT service management was really predicated on having a truly comprehensive asset inventory, which nothing in IT really had. But guess where you would develop your comprehensive asset inventory? Typically, it was doing a vulnerability assessment. And same sort of thing. If you really wanted to discover where your assets were, or how they were exposed, you wouldn't necessarily, the IT ops system wouldn't necessarily be the system of record, but the insight that the security team had would be. And now we're seeing echoes of that again today. And it's actually kind of getting into the XDR space as well, too, with respect to IT observability, for example. So we see this desire to extend telemetry into these more complex cloud environments, not just a landing zone per se, but cloud environments have a lot of integrations with third-party resources, dependencies, APIs to other applications that may have nothing to do with a given specific architecture within, say, a given hyperscaler's environment or even a service mesh. And looking into how those complex interrelationships affect things like availability and performance, that's clearly job number one for IT observability today. But there is a security use case, obviously, there as well, too. So we're starting to see that pattern emerge yet again. And in fact, the data that we've seen here at 451, as far as the increasing cooperation between, if you want to consider DevOps teams more on the development and operational side, and security teams, just looking at the metrics on application security tool usage, just to name one. 5 years ago, we saw that twice as many security respondents were using AppSec tools than developers. Now that's at parity. It's like 48% to 52%. 48% application or development teams versus 52% security teams saying they're using AppSec tools. So we can continue to see these areas of convergence between the interests of IT operational concerns and security concerns. But you're right, without a focus on that specific use case for security, it's not going to be nearly as actionable for security teams.
So earlier, Scott, you said that XDR is what cybersecurity from the start really, it was the promise, or what security ops or operations teams had hoped it would be. And I agree, this is sort of what we've been working towards for a couple of decades here. But how do companies keep XDR from becoming the next sellout buzzword? We've seen some of these promising techs before, and yet they die out in a few years. So what's to say this won't be the next hyped up thing?
Well, this is an area where, particularly from our point of view here at 451, we're relying on what practitioners tell us about what's of value, what's truly actionable to them. So that's really going to be our North Star, if you will, as far as what actually resonates with people who do the real world work. What do they find of value in this versus how is it being stretched as a marketing term and a marketing opportunity? The difficulty with that, though, is that to some extent, it depends on a number of variables that have to do with the security team itself. What's their level of maturity in terms of integrating a variety of data sources into their ability to detect and reduce the, if you want to consider like mean time to response, for example, what is meaningful in terms of the data that they take in, process, and act on to shorten those time windows. What's their level of sophistication with respect to, their own, if you will, assets under management? An organization that is is not primarily a technology organization and is managing mostly, typical end user consumer technology is going to have a very different level of concern than an organization that's building its own SaaS application to compete in a very competitive market. And the level of telemetry you're going to need on the back end of that is very different from what the telemetry that the end user on the front end that's actually consuming a SaaS application would need in their use case. So there's a lot of variables there, and that's one reason why I am loath to shut the door on the possibility for XDR, because when this question comes up, my response usually is, well, what the heck do you think that X means in the first place? We know that there's going to be opportunity to extend. I mentioned IT observability. We're seeing that opportunity beginning to take shape right now. In fact, if we look at the investment space, some of the companies that have been most highly invested in terms of like funding rounds and certainly some of these astronomical valuations we've been seeing are really, one of the things they're doing is looking at pushing the frontiers of threat detection and response into these environments where today a lot of security teams just don't have that much literacy or expertise to necessarily know what they're seeing. So they're trying to make that more tangible and actionable for those teams in some of those cases. So I hear what you're saying, but I am a little bit reluctant to shut the door on the X because that X implies frontiers for the future that we don't yet know what's going to be valuable.
So
I agree. I certainly hope this isn't, the next buzzwordy thing. From your experience in talking to enterprises, what percentage of organizations and teams using XDR are using it more for the visibility aspect right now than the detection and or response? Because we know when newer technologies come out, there's a lot of let's see what we see before let's act. So are we there yet with XDR? Are people actually able? I know you just said that it depends on the maturity, but in general, what are you seeing?
So I want to pull the conversation a bit back more down to earth. As Adrian well knows, analysts have a tendency to see what will be more common currency 2 to 5 years down the road, really. Whereas what practitioners are dealing with today may not be there yet in a lot of cases. In fact, speaking with one CISO not that long ago, they were looking up a definition of XDR while we were talking. And
understandable. Totally understandable.
Yeah, of course.
I think that validates my question a little bit.
Absolutely.
Of course. Yeah. And so just to put a period on that thought, Tyler. So what they do is they're telling me what they see in terms of what they're doing around, primarily threat detection and to the extent that they couple response with it. So it's the technologies they currently have in place. There's a fair amount of investment in, say, endpoint threat detection and response. There's some investment in network visibility as well, too, although they might not call it NDR, but they may have made an investment in Bro, for example, just to name one. or other approaches that have been about enhancing visibility that they're still using and elaborating on. So let's be practical about this. When they hear that, what they're interpreting that is as what are we using today and where do we look to extend that tomorrow? And by the way, that's increasingly beginning to include service providers that are getting more focused on a strategy predicated on threat detection and response.
So my follow-on question, very similar to what Katie's asking, is I feel like XDR is a term. If CISOs today don't know what XDR is, it's probably because it's so overloaded with so many different marketing versions of different versions of what XDR could be that nobody really knows what it is anymore, right? And so much to, I think what Katie was trying to get at is, okay, maybe the terminology of XDR is kind of jumping the shark. And I do personally believe it is. I don't like the term XDR for a number of reasons, which is probably a hot take that'll get me in trouble publicly. But that being said, the question I had, though, is if XDR is connecting to everything in an API-driven world and a cloud-driven world and pulling all of that telemetry into a central system, does this eventually upend or disrupt ServiceNow?
I don't think so, because you've seen the trajectory that ServiceNow has been on and looking to, associate themselves, particularly with the response end of that conversation. So let me just add a little bit of color, again, from the practitioner point of view. I put out some findings from one of our surveys from earlier this year. And the top category, when we asked organizations, what was their, which technologies did they either have in pilot or proof of concept now, or in their plan for the next 6 to 24 months? XDR came out on top, but I've got to read on that. And as you guys might rightly assume, that was a contentious point, to say the least. But I do have a read on that, because these are their responses from a considerable body of practitioners. What that says to me is that a definition of XDR is not nearly as significant to those respondents as threat detection itself. And I would say subjectively, secondarily, response as well, too. They're very attuned to the need to be more aware of the threats targeting their environment. There's a corollary to that we've seen, particularly in mergers and acquisitions over the past year. And that's what I've called the outside-in view, meaning two things primarily. One is a better view of the adversary. So that's traditionally where we consider threat intelligence. But secondarily, the adversary's view of the target, and that's embracing a number of sort of emerging segments that do have a fair amount of overlap in a lot of cases. So everything from attack surface management to automated penetration testing, continuous automated security controls testing and validation, another area I know you're familiar with, Adrian. Even to the extent of things like risk-based vulnerability management, if you're doing your assessment based on is something actively being attacked or exploited. And to a certain degree, an even more difficult problem to get hands around for a lot of for a lot of people, let alone organizations, was our dependency on our third-party providers. And of course, that's been a very hot topic generally over the last year. So they're aware of the need to have better eyes on the adversary and what the adversary sees, but they're also wanting to couple that with the inside-out view, and that's where threat detection and response plays a pretty significant role for them. And it has, particularly over the course of the last year.
Is there a situation here where they're trying to embrace and tackle too much, making efficacy on any one sub-segment negligible or more difficult? Is that a risk for XDR as a market?
That's a really interesting question. My gut tells me, yes, they probably are, but that may be a function of the market and the evolution of the tech, at least anyway, and the services that are growing up around it in part. So, a lot of people have felt for a long time, the endpoint's going to be target number one. But as you know, Tyler, and Adrian for that matter as well too, and Katie, you as well, the functionality that's deployed to deliver that telemetry on cloud workloads is sometimes rather similar, if not actually the same functionality that's often deployed even on the end user endpoint with some modifications. Now you're not going to be running an eBPF, not going to be running an eBPF tool on an endpoint unless you're running a Linux endpoint, say, for example. But, well, that's not necessarily true either. But Yeah, there's some blind spots there. And one of them probably is, my sense is, on two fronts. One of them is visibility into the cloud security posture, but at a level of detail to give them actionable insight into where those assets are being targeted. Because let's just take the easy case of ransomware. Popping identities, popping accounts, getting access and a foothold at an endpoint is only, the first step and the first rung on the ladder. You're looking for those high value assets, and those are typically managed in these more centralized computing environments. So I'm expecting better visibility, better practices to evolve around that particular area in the not too distant future.
Yeah. So, I think one of the things I look for, or I used to look for as an analyst, when we have a new category enter in, is what is this replacing? Do companies have to come up with entirely new budgets for this? Is it priced and staffed at a point where it's a niche product? I'm interested to hear your thoughts there. I definitely have some thoughts here, but is XDR just a completely separate standalone category, or do you see it replacing existing stuff? Which I think makes it, the more it can replace stuff, the more likely it is to catch on and be an actual thing in the future, I think. Yeah,
that's a pretty valid point. And that's always been a very thought-provoking point of yours on that particular question. I consider, as I know you have as well too, and Tyler, you have as well too from your past experience, that we are living in a market that is largely a features market. In fact, what I mean by that is we've all grown up around, startups and pure plays that aren't really that well seen as so much standalone, no matter how they might position or seek to posture that way, so much as they look, walk, and talk like a feature of a larger, and in this case, the term solution may not be overused. So let's just use it in the academic sense, at least anyway. We've seen that a lot. Is there room for displacement of these? So in terms of endpoint in particular, we've seen a consolidation of functionalities. I know you've seen as well, with endpoint threat detection versus endpoint protection platforms. So what we used to think of as standalone antivirus and to a certain extent host intrusion prevention, but also coupling functionality as far as, like browser isolation and sandboxing. More comprehensive approaches to these we're seeing becoming more consistent across the market. So maybe not replacing so much, but a consolidation of features and functions to the extent that buyers expect that consolidation and that more comprehensive functionality out of their preferred choices.
So let's move on a bit to talking about the future of the SOC before we wrap things up here. I'm interested to hear what you're kind of seeing going on there. Some of the CISOs I'm talking to are working on more distributed SOCs, where folks who are asset owners, who are subject matter experts, not necessarily security folks, kind of take that role, that first level of investigation into something, or maybe even a second or third level of investigation, and maybe you still have a traditional SOC doing the telephone operator, I like to call it, pulling out the the 1/4-inch jacks and plugging them into the right places. But I also kind of think like that's the most likely tier, like function of the SOC to get replaced by AI, ML, or just a different model, like this more distributed model. So I'm kind of curious what you're seeing there. I'm not sure how much the tools are going to affect that, as I'm just not sure most SOCs are very effective right now.
Well, interesting that you put it that way, because one of the most
I meant to say efficient, but effective works too.
Well, it kind of depends on who and what. But it's interesting that you put it that way, because one of the significant trends that we're seeing right now is we've seen this trajectory building over the last few years, but nothing like in the past year. We've seen a big uptick in the adoption of managed security services. And even more specifically, we've seen service providers moving more into specific segments of managed security services, whereas before the traditional MSSP was kind of broad-based, kind of taking on a lot of opportunities, but really focusing on some of the more if you will, commodity aspects of the service, like let us manage your security devices, for example. Elaborating more into, outsourcing aspects of the SOC. But now we're seeing them moving into specific segments like managed threat detection and response. And there's a number of names, we could throw out that people would recognize and say, oh yeah, that's MDR. SOC as a service, sort of a close adjunct and some overlap, obviously, with managed detection and response with that. The number of people that we'd seen adopting managed security services by percentage doubled over this past year. And at the same time, the number of those who said that security services were not in plan fell by half in our surveys conducted this year. And that began to strike me when I talked to a CISO last year, about this time last year. And I was asking him how the pandemic had affected his SOC workforce, because, a lot of security professionals can work remotely. The setup is not prohibitive of that. But he didn't answer with how able they were to work remotely. His first thing out of his mouth was, man, if you're not outsourcing your SOC operations, I don't know what you're doing. And you got to consider the source. He was working in healthcare with about, I would call it a mid-sized clinical health organization. So, investment in IT and security technology, not job number one in that vertical. Investment in clinical technology and enabling healthcare is their priority for sure, but also have a very priority on security and securing everything from sensitive information to increasingly sensitive clinical functionality as well. So, but that was the first thing out of his mouth. And so it got me started, taking a look at that more seriously, to the extent that the trend we're seeing now is that a lot of these MDR providers have invested in their underlying platform to enable their service and functionality to the point where the platform itself gets as much visibility as the services offering, to the extent that it's even branded in a lot of cases. By the same token, we're seeing technology product vendors increasingly embracing services, not just for deployment and for customer success in, having a purchase turn out well, but ongoing and more truly managed services as part of their overall portfolio. So that's interesting to me, because we're seeing this convergence between technology and services that, it's getting a little bit difficult to really cleanly tease out one from the other. And I think that kind of goes with the territory. The level of expertise that you need to really do an effective job at threat detection and response means you got to have some chops in the space, and you have to have the experience to do so. We all know the issues with hiring, and no matter what you think is the cause or the main contributing factors, we all have issues with securing expertise. Service providers can be a center of attraction for that expertise, as can technology vendors for that matter. And this expertise needs to reach even more broadly. Attackers see the mid-market and verticals where the investment in technology is not as highly prioritized as being targets of opportunity, have for years. But with we used to talk about the industrialization of attacks, and now it's an economy in its own right, where there's service providers and specialized expertise in that area. And, they're really catering to finding the best opportunities for success in those types of attacks and those types of threats. So, the expertise is needed and becoming increasingly part and parcel, no matter what your offering is. It's primarily services, primarily technology. The two of them are going more hand in hand. So an outsourcing of that expertise, outsourcing of SOC operations itself, I see as being a significant trend. And you talk about the adoption and embrace of AI. That has to be more a part of what we do, just because of the volume of information and the ability to recognize changes and things that people simply can't is absolutely necessary. But who's in the best position to make those investments? Either security's one percenters, as I referred to them when I first came here at 451, or those for whom it's a specialized area of expertise. So those two trends, I think, are influencing each other.
Yeah, definitely. So I've got two oddball questions for you as we wrap up here. We've got to try and make them somewhat concise. But just want to hit you with these. In the last 18 months, a lot of pilots have retired. A lot of commercial pilots. Is there a place for them in InfoSec? And if so, what would that role be?
Boy, that is one of the best questions I think I've heard in a long time. And it's funny listening to Shoshana talking earlier about the challenges of sourcing personnel expertise. I'm a big fan of sourcing non-traditional expertise, not least because, as you alluded at the beginning of the session here, I have an unconventional background myself. I was a music major at one time, so I did not take that very well when people were being critical of that with a rather high-profile incident of a couple of years ago.
Yes,
I remember that. Well, I used to know a guy who hired developers, would only hire classical musicians, and I think classical pianists for developers, because
I remember you telling me about that.
Yeah, their ability to follow individual lines of logic that were nevertheless very closely and intimately related to each other through harmony. If you could read a score, your chances of being able to parse through a complex dev project, he felt, were natively a lot better. So those are the aspects of a creative sourcing of personnel that I really value. I went from there to being a science major.
I'm trying to put you on the spot here, Scott. Pilots, where do you put them?
Pilots. Oh, right. I put them as
where in
very
a security
strong
organization.
Very strong candidates because of a couple things. The discipline of knowing that your life depends, and not just your life, but the lives of your passengers depends on your ability to achieve and maintain situational awareness, not just in a warfighter scenario, but in a civilian scenario as well, too. Things can go south right away. And there is no mock exercise in survival when things go south on you. You get one chance. And so the emphasis on precision and detail, really valuable. At the same time, the level of care and concern for those for whom you're responsible. If your passengers get there safely, you're probably going to get there safely too, and vice versa. So yeah, there's a lot of good qualities to an aviator that I think really recommend themselves well in security. Great question. And now I'm going to start looking at resumes for that a lot more carefully.
That's great. Scott, thanks so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, everybody. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly Enterprise News.